We made it. The end of the decade. 2019 is over, just about, and 2020 is upon us. This is the type of video you can only make once every 10 years, so we're doing it. These are my top 10 favorite games of the decade. Now, before we get started, I gotta say these are my personal picks. Obviously, I expect everyone's to be different. I certainly hope so, because there are some oddball choices in here, because these are my top 10 favorite games of the decade. Not necessarily what I think are the 10 best games of the decade. That's like a separate list. So we're not holding back. There's guilty pleasures. There's things on this list that I'm not proud of. So is Skyrim on this list? No. Is Last of Us on this list? Hell no. And I loved The Last of Us, but it's one of those things where it's like, I really appreciate that game and I really loved and enjoyed the experience, but when it was all over, is that something I'm going to go back to time and time again and keep revisiting and keep replaying? Hell no, dude. The Last of Us, it's like the Schindler's List of video games. What an analogy. It's like Schindler's List. What a masterpiece. What an amazing film. Is that like something you would want to return to over and over again? Definitely not. So that's the approach that I took with this list. We're not holding anything back. There's some dark stuff on this list. Let's get started. Alright, so let's start it off with an obvious one. Resident Evil 2 Remake. This is a game that was one of my most anticipated games ever, because Resident Evil 2 is probably my favorite of the classic Resident Evil games. And this game, it just delivered. It just delivered on everything. Capcom's story in the last 10 years is an interesting one, because I think they really started off the decade very struggling. They weren't doing very well. A lot of the games that they were putting out, they weren't hitting, like Resident Evil 6. But the Capcom Renaissance has been one of my favorite stories of this generation. Capcom has resurged as one of my favorite game developers out there. They have some of my favorite franchises, and they've put out some of my favorite games. So it is a remake, but it's not like a beat-for-beat, one-to-one remake. It's a complete re-envisioning that's extremely faithful, but also makes some very, necessary and smart changes. Resident Evil 2 Remake, it's probably, the more time that passes, it's like, man, it might be one of my favorite Resident Evil games, period, which is crazy because it's one of my favorite franchises. It's like they kept the horror, the game is very scary. They kept the horror, they kept the suspense, they kept the tension, but they also somehow made it fun to play. That's actually a really hard thing to balance. The hard part is over. Rolf! No. Oh man. I told you I'm not holding anything back. My deepest, darkest secrets. Who would have thought, man? Stardew Valley. This game totally caught me by surprise. I think it was just the right game at the right time for me. It's the most chill game. I love the pixel art, the music. You could focus on farming, you could focus on fishing, on mining. Really, there's a goal to the game. You want to make money. There's no wrong way to play this game. You can do whatever you want. It's like Animal Crossing meets Harvest Moon. This game is fantastic, and I have bought this game 3 times. I have it on my Switch, I have it on PC, and I have it on PS4, and I've sunk a crap load of time into each of them. And for such a simple game, there's so much to it. Yes, you're farming, but there's so many different ways to farm. There's so many different kinds of crops and strategies, and the game just keeps getting more and more support. They keep adding new things, they're adding more maps. And of course, about a year ago, they added the big multiplayer update, which has completely revitalized the game for me. And playing it with friends is such a blast. And shoutouts to Concerned Ape, the developer of the game, who signed my copy of my guidebook. Okay, next up is Fire Emblem Awakening on the Nintendo 3DS. Fire Emblem Awakening, I think, really marked a big change for the series. It's kind of divisive amongst hardcore Fire Emblem fans because it introduced certain things that, were not really traditional in Fire Emblem games, such as the romancing options and having kids, and it became a bit of a waifu simulator combined with an extremely deep, hardcore tactical strategy RPG. It's such a bizarre mix, but it's also kind of the game that saved Fire Emblem in the West. This was to be the last Fire Emblem game because a lot of them just haven't really sold very well before that, but this game just knocked it out of the park and was extremely popular, which is why we have so many Fire Emblem games coming out now. And I love the characters in this game. I love the artwork and the storyline. I know that, yes, the waifu simulators and having the kids and all that stuff, but there was actually a lot of strategy to that. And some of the children units, and you can customize, matching certain people to like give that kid certain abilities. It was actually really cool. There's more to it than just like a dating sim. Now, it is worth mentioning that I finished Fire Emblem Three Houses this year, which was amazing. One of my favorite games of the year. In my Game of the Year talk, I gave it like second runner-up to Resident Evil 2 Remake. And maybe because the fact that it's so recent, Fire Emblem Awakening made my list instead of Three Houses, but maybe as time passes that might change. Who knows? Time will tell. Man, I love Mass Effect. In particular, Mass Effect 2 makes my list for one of my favorite games of the decade. Mass Effect 2, coming hot off of Mass Effect 1, it fixed everything that was wrong with Mass Effect 1. Mass Effect, when it first came out, was great, but it was a little rough around the edges. It had a ton of promise, but it didn't quite 100% deliver. It was still an excellent game. More than anything, I really liked the Mass Effect universe, all of the races and the planets, and just like all the lore that they've built, all the world building. I think it's really, really impressive, and it doesn't get enough credit. But Mass Effect 2, the game ran way better, the combat was way better, the storyline was amazing, the suicide mission, all of the side characters, Thane and Miranda. Ah, man. Mass Effect 2 is definitely the best Mass Effect game in the entire series. And I'm a guy who even likes Mass Effect 3 in spite of the ending. I think that game gets way too much flack, and I think Mass Effect 3 has some of the best gameplay in the series, but of course, the blunder at the end, and then of course what happened with Mass Effect Andromeda was a complete, total shame. And I really hope we haven't heard the last of that series. I think they put it on ice, but the lore and the world building, and there's still a lot of Mass Effect fans out there. I think we've definitely not seen the last of Mass Effect.
Garrus, what are you doing here?
Man, it was such a toss-up between Dark Souls and Bloodborne. These are two of my favorite games of the last 10 years. These are two of my favorite games of all time, but I didn't want to put them both on the list, so I will put Dark Souls on there to kind of represent all of the Soulsborne games. And I don't know, man, Dark Souls, there's something about this game, and it's got a feeling to it. It's not the best looking game in the series, obviously. I have so many like memories tied to this game. It takes me back to such a specific time and place in my life. When this game first came out, I had first moved out of my parents' house for the very first time, and I was out there making it on my own, and it was just me in this empty ass apartment, and no furniture, just a computer chair and a flat screen TV and Dark Souls, and that's just forever drilled in my mind. The game is extremely hard, extremely challenging, but also very, very rewarding, and some of the best boss fights in the entire series. And it's just, the gameplay loop is just so addictive, just collecting souls, and the combat is just so tight, it's so unique. There's no other game that really feels quite like it. I know some people have a hard time getting into the Souls games, but the only thing I can really recommend is it's a game you really gotta sink your teeth into, and don't be afraid to fail, because once you've actually grasped it, it's not actually as difficult as it seems, and once you're in, man, you get really sucked into it, and there's so much fun to be had in the entire Soulsborne series. I told y'all that there was going to be some weird picks on this list, some things that are going to raise some eyebrows. Next up, we're going to go Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. Now this is probably surprising for a lot of people. I love fighting games. I needed to include a fighting game on my top 10 list. And Marvel vs. Capcom 3 and Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 came out at a time where fighting games were really starting to make a massive resurgence thanks to Street Fighter 4. And this was just like the extra, the cherry on top. Like, fighting games were back, and now we got Street Fighter and Marvel, two of the most like celebrated fighting game series of all time. For the year this game came out, the visuals are so heavily carried by the art style. This game still looks incredible. It looks so good. I love the art style in this game. In fact, I think it's way, way better than Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. Just visually and aesthetically so much more pleasing, and the music is top-notch, the roster is insane. The game's so broken. It's so ridiculously broken. Touch of death combos everywhere. The online is such a struggle, such a slog, and I'm terrible at it. I'm not even good at this game. But I love all of the fan service, I love all the characters, and I have fun playing it, and that's the most important thing. You can spend hours and hours and hours just in training mode, coming up with your team, strategizing, coming up with combos. This game really emphasizes player freedom, and there's so many styles and ways to play, and so many characters and assists, and so many options. I know once you get to like high level play, like the best players, you end up seeing the same handful of characters over and over again. But I'm talking about from a casual level. I'm trash at the game, so from a casual level, just jumping in and just playing, this game is a ton of fun. I got real close to putting this one in or Tekken 7. I also, when it comes to Street Fighter 4, I would say in the compendium of things that Street Fighter 4 really started in the 2000s. Alright, now next up is 2016's Doom. Now this game was such a huge surprise, completely caught me off guard. This game was such a breath of fresh air into the FPS genre, which was being completely dominated by things like Call of Duty and Battlefield and all of these things. And now you got this arcade shooter that doesn't let you aim down sights, doesn't have any emphasis at all on taking cover or anything like that. This is a run and gun game where you get in there, you get in that ass, and you just feel like such a badass. It really is all about empowering the player. You're not hiding behind things, you're not taking it slow, you're not being stealthy, you are getting in, you're playing fast, you're ripping things apart with your hands, you're shooting people point blank with a shotgun. One of the best shotguns in video games, by the way. And the game is so buttery smooth, going at 60 frames per second. On PC, you can get this game up to 4K, 60 FPS. It is insanity. Okay, next up is The Witcher 3. Of course. Now, up until this point, I really steer cleared of a lot of these like heavy hitters. I don't have Red Dead 2 on this list. I don't have God of War on this list. I don't even have Breath of the Wild on this list, and I love all of those games. But when it comes to like, is it my favorite? Is this like something I can see myself returning to again and again and again? Witcher 3 is one of those games. It's just so undeniable how good this game is. Just the quest lines. Some of the side quests in this game rival like the writing and storytelling in most games like main quest lines. It's so ridiculous. Just like having flashbacks to like the Bloody Baron quest line. It's just like the writing is just so phenomenal. Every inch of the world is so detailed and there's so much to do. There's almost too much to do. I think that's one of the reasons I want to keep going back, because there's so many new things to discover every time I pick up that game. Like, I could continue to sing the praise about this game, but it's already been talked about to death. The Witcher 3 is arguably one of the, if not the best game of the decade, and it easily made its way into my top 10 favorite games of the decade. Okay, next up on my list is Resident Evil 7, particularly playing in VR. Now I know I don't want to put several games from the same series on this list. I didn't want to do that for Bloodborne and Dark Souls, but Resident Evil 7 is so unique and so insanely different than every game that came before it in the series, and might even be different than anything that comes afterwards too. It's such an anomaly that it definitely deserves its place as its own standalone thing. And this game, especially if you are playing in VR, is one of the most terrifying experiences you can have in any form of entertainment, any movie, any video game, anything. He's fucking Terminator, dude! It's honestly one of the craziest video game experiences I've ever had. When you have that headset on, you feel like you're there. And why it works so well in Resident Evil 7 is that obviously when you're in VR, you're gonna have a lot of graphical limitations. Things aren't gonna look as good. But when you're confined to like a dark space, a narrow hallway, they can really up the detail on a lot of those things because you're not really seeing that much all at once. You're in such confined places for like 95% of the game. So the game really looks amazing in VR. It looks incredible. Probably one of the best looking VR games out there. And the game itself is so fun. It is classic Resident Evil from a completely different perspective. I loved exploring the Baker Mansion, finding different keys hidden in different areas and solving these puzzles. It really is like a classic Resident Evil experience. And while Resident Evil 2 Remake was very scary, I think RE7 takes the terror and dials it up to like 11. Some of the characters in this game are outright terrifying. Look at Jack Baker. Jack Baker is one of the most unique villains in the entire Resident Evil series. You have like a charismatic villain who just talks trash the entire time. He is fantastic. And then the story in itself is actually way better than I thought it would be. I can't give this game enough praise. I always think it's remarkable when a video game series is able to reinvent itself time and time again. I think some of the best series have done that. But I think honestly it is the necessary thing to do, and I always commend games that are willing to take risks with established franchises. You know, you think of Zelda, you think of Resident Evil 7, Final Fantasy even. They take a lot of risks, and I think that's commendable. I hate it when a game series keeps doing the same thing over and over. I'm looking at you, Pokemon. Okay, here we go. Now, there's some very strong opinions on this game out there. Some very strong opinions. I told you guys outright that I'm not going to bullshit you. I'm going to keep it real. Because this game is absolutely a guilty pleasure of mine. I would be outright lying to you if I did not include it on my top 10 list. And that's Destiny. Destiny, no game have I sunk more hours into in the last decade. Especially when this game first came out in year 1, which ironically is when the game got the most flack, when there was the most blowback on this game and the most controversy. But that's when I had the most fun with this game. It was definitely not beginner friendly. It was definitely not casual gamer friendly. It was extremely hardcore. Like, the exotic guns and the exotic weapons that you would earn in the game, they were truly exotic and hard to find. It was such a big deal when you would get an exotic because they were so hard to get. The RNG gods were cruel in vanilla Destiny. It's absolutely a love it or hate it kind of game. And if somebody doesn't like Destiny, I totally get it. I totally understand. But I was in the camp of absolutely loving it. And it was so hardcore and it was such a grind. It was such a grind. Once you finally got the weapon that you were looking for, then there's certain weapon perks. So you got the gun you're looking for, but did you get the right weapon perks? And then you gotta spend all this time leveling it up. It was such a grind fest. But once you were finally geared out, once you finally got the Gallahorn that you were finally looking for, it was like magic. It was insane. The raids were so incredible, just like the experiences I had playing this game with friends. And that's the thing too, is that my experience with Destiny was so good because of the friends I was playing it with. We had a set fire team. We would always be on every single night. And I legitimately made new friends playing Destiny, which is something I've never really done in a game before. And while yes, it was grindy, this is Bungie we're talking about. Some of the best gunplay in all of video games. It's like a grindy game that's fun to grind. I think that's something that's kind of lost on a lot of people. Obviously, Destiny 2 is still popular, still going strong, and I think the future is bright for the Destiny series, especially now that Bungie is independent once again and they have the Destiny license and everything. They are Activision free, so I think there are good things on the horizon. And while I'm not actively playing Destiny anymore, I think there's a good chance I'll pick it up again in the future. That is it. Those are my top 10 favorite games of the last 10 years. It's been a good 10 years for video games, and we'll be back in 10 more years for the top 10 games of 2020. And of course, let me know what your guys' favorite games are of the last decade. Thank you so much for watching. Have a happy new year. Peace out.